Welcome back for day 2 of the Coffee and Cloud Excellence Workshop. We really appreciate you joining us. We've got a great lineup of speakers today, but I also want to give a quick reminder for tonight's event at 6:30 Eastern. We'll have a dueling concert. They'll be joining us live from Denver and taking requests from the past and of holiday music. So bring your families, bring your festive gear and join us. And also a quick reminder that for everyone attending, we're making a $10 donation on your behalf to Toys for Tots today. I'm going to introduce our regional technical leader, Brian Morovitz, who's going to give an overview of today's agenda and our speakers. Over to you, Brian.
Great. Thanks, Brittany. Welcome back for day 2. We're going to build on a lot of the topics and themes introduced by Aaron and Adam and our friends at AWS. And we're going to go around that Cloud One pie a little bit. We're going to talk about DevOps and adding security in a frictionless fashion. Rafi's got a great session for us. And then one of our longtime engineers, Zach Millam's going to talk about building secure applications and container security. And leading up to one of my favorites at 10:30, Jamie O'Mara from Snyk is going to talk about the integration and expansion of security in a seamless fashion. And then we're going to round out the day with a little more on the Cloud One story with file storage security and our new network security offering with Phil Ogle. And then look forward to getting a bit of hands-on with Matt Chapman, who did our zero login exercise yesterday. He'll be accompanied by Nick Farrell and a number of other SEs. So you guys can roll up your sleeves, play with the product a bit, and we'll be there to help facilitate hands-on. So with no further ado, let's get started with Raf and go from there. And in the spirit of Christmas, bring your sweater, bring your decorations, and have a little fun with us this evening. It all goes to a good cause, not just a bit of education, but helping Toys for Tots. So make us really spend a lot of money today and bring a few folks along for the evening event.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. Rafael Bocino here. Raf for short. I'm a solutions architect here at Trend Micro. And we're going to discuss a little bit of how to implement security, frictionless security in DevOps. And actually, I have a question for you, and a poll question should pop up here for you. So we can start the conversation. Just want to check how would you describe your role as within your organization today? I see people are starting to answer: management, security engineer, cloud engineer, operations. Okay, good. A lot of answers. I like that. All right, so say management / team lead and operations are the biggest two here. Cloud engineer, really close. Nice. Okay. Interesting to see just one security engineer on a Trend Micro conversation. I love that, actually. There's another question here if you're using Control Tower. Should pop up right now. Okay. Interesting. Nobody using AWS Control Tower, which could mean that you're not using AWS at all, right? Good. Okay. Thank you. All right. So frictionless security in DevOps. But first, we need to discuss what the heck DevOps is, right? So if you want to be really technical about it, it's really hard to say what it is because there isn't a manifesto, right? You cannot go to devops.com and read what DevOps is, right? Nobody wrote a manifesto about DevOps as we have for Agile, for instance, right? The first time that the term DevOps was used, however, was more than 10 years ago. It was in 2009 in Velocity Conference. And actually the person that coined this term, Patrick Debois, is currently working with our partner Snyk. So we're going to hear about Snyk later today. And how can we implement DevOps even though we're not super sure about what it is? it's a combination of culture, people, feedback, fast value to your customer, and probably tools. So you don't go to a shop and buy DevOps. DevOps isn't tools, but tools might help you implement what you want to achieve, right? So I think if we want to pick one to be really specific here would be fast, right? And fast to the business could mean different things. All of them really important, right? It could mean faster time to market. So from an idea on a piece of paper on a whiteboard to the hands of your customers, that's faster time to market, right? Faster feedback. It's also really important, and we're going to discuss that soon. Removing obstacles, right? So it doesn't matter if you have the biggest idea, the greatest idea in the world, but you have so many obstacles internally that your developers cannot deliver on that, right? So we need to remove obstacles. And de-risking new capabilities. So is it risky to introduce something new? If it is, you probably will hold to that, right? So it means they're going to be slower. So de-risking new capabilities is also being faster in business terms, right? And according to the State of DevOps, it's a report ran by Puppet every year. I think this one was 2019, if I'm not mistaken. They had a comparison between high and low performance organizations, okay? And the difference is clear. If organizations that consider themselves high performatic, they have almost 1,500 deployments per year versus 32 on average for low performance organizations. So if we're discussing speed, right? Deployment is a really good metric for speed, right? Change lead time is also another metric, a really good metric. 60 minutes on average on high perform organizations versus almost 27,000 minutes on low perform organizations. And lead time, change lead time is pretty much from developer finishing write the code to customer using the code, right? An hour is amazing because if we just discuss about delivering value faster customer, how crazy it is, right? When you have developers writing all this code and this code is exactly what your customer needs, but you need to wait almost 27,000 minutes to be able to deliver the code to your customer because of your infrastructure or your operations, right? So DevOps can help you bring all this speed to your business, okay? If we take the example of one of our partners, if I'm not mistaken, they're even sponsoring the session today, AWS, right? Amazon. Amazon is capable of handling a new software deployment every second. This is huge, right? This means that whenever they see a new market or the market is changing and they realize that, it means that they can really quickly change directions in order to go with the market, right? Because it literally takes 1 second to deploy a new software version. I guess that's why we have this person over here really happy. Something that I mentioned before was feedback, right? And feedback is really important for DevOps as well, because you need to be able to move quickly based on everybody's feedback, everybody that's involved in the loop, right? From development to operations to your customer, you should be able to act fast on the feedback, okay? So let's take an example of a restaurant, right? So you make an order, the waiter is going to take their order back to the chef. The chef is going to prepare the order, is going to handle that to the waiter. The waiter is going to go back to you with the food. and let's say that first spoon of that soup, you make that face where clearly you didn't like that much, right? It takes a few iterations, sorry, to get that feedback back to the chef, so they can rework the recipe, right? But if you go to a hibachi restaurant where the food is cooked right in front of you, the feedback is it happens right in front of the chef, right? So in a way, hibachi is almost like DevOps because they're shortening the feedback loop as much as possible. As soon as your customer has any behavior towards that value that you're delivering, the food in this case, you're going to right away know if it's actually value or if it's something that your customer doesn't want or doesn't like. So you can really quickly abandon that recipe, change the recipe, create a new recipe. So think of, if you want to summarize, you can maybe think that DevOps is just like hibachi, right? Or an even better way to see DevOps is the only key differentiator customers have left, right? This is DevOps because there are competing business in the market, right? And most of them deliver pretty much about the same thing. But if you're the first one to deliver that, you're the one that is going to be remembered of. You're the one that is going to be probably used the most, right? You can think of Uber instead of Lyft. You can think of Netflix instead of HBO Max, right? They were the first. And to be the first, you need to be fast. You need to have supporting infrastructure to deliver that, right? But again, I haven't talked about security yet. So I'll try to go quick because I know that I'm a little bit behind. For those that are security here, feel free to use the chat window if you want to. But if you're security or work in a role that is related to security, do you think that development moves way too fast? But also, if you're development, do you think that security moves way too slow? Usually when I make these questions to the audience, I pretty much know the answers already. It's yes and yes, of course. And the thing is that this is not because security is actually slow or because development is super fast. It's just a question of numbers, right? If you look back at your organization, you're going to see that this graph over here is pretty much precise, right? We have, I don't know, hundreds of development people to, dozens of infrastructure people, operations people. And then when you look at security, half a person, sorry. That's usually what happens, right? So it's not a matter of security doesn't want to play along or development doesn't want to play along. It's just a matter of security is outnumbered by development, right? So we need to find a way to better leverage the security resources within the company, right? And DevOps might be the answer for that, or DevSecOps if that's what is going to make it happen in your organization. So I actually stole that image. The source is in the bottom of the slide, but I really like it. Take a moment to see what is happening here, right? DevOps is doing, it's a unicorn, it's beautiful, doing all these beautiful things, and security is right behind cleaning the mess, right? At least that's some feel, right? They want to help, and that's the only way they feel they can help. But Jen Kim, he's a really well-known guy in the DevOps community. He's the author of books like the Phoenix Project. He shared that over Twitter, and I love it. He heard that in a VMworld event. He heard, I'm the security guy, I put in no innovation, right? And we still have people like that. We do, unfortunately we do, right? But we cannot be that person anymore because whoever tries to be between the business need of deploying something new to the market to deliver value to customer and the customer is going to be put aside, right? So we cannot be that guy anymore. And if you're finding it hard to have discussions around security with your teammates, especially DevOps teammates, they probably read this book already, The Phoenix Project. And if you haven't, I highly recommend reading this book so you can understand a little bit better on the DevOps journey. And between all these amazing things that the book says, there's one part here that I brought to our conversation, and it says, we're hearing more lately something called DevOps. Maybe everyone attending this party is a form of DevOps, but I suspect it's something much more than that. It's product management, development, IT operations, and even information security, all working together and supporting one another. So that's a great message to us, security, but also to development, right? Because security is part of this party called DevOps as well, right? We don't need to call it the DevSecOps to make it work. The DevOps Handbook. In high-performing organizations, everyone within the team shares a common goal. Quality, availability, and even security aren't the responsibility of individual departments, but are a part of everyone's job every day, right? So even the DevOps Handbook mentions security as part of everybody's job every day. And if you look at the cover of the book, actually it's part of the title, right? Agility, reliability, and security in technology organizations. If you need some help to convince your development team that they should be supporting security as well, take the State of DevOps report. They say that automating security policy configurations is mission critical to reaching the highest level of DevOps evolution. Highly evolved organizations are 24 times more likely to always automate security policy configurations compared to the least evolved organizations. So that's the key, right? If we look back at the graph where security is outnumbered, there is no way that we can, with traditional security, looking at a spreadsheet, taking notes of IP addresses, nothing like that is going to work on this new scenario, right? Automation is key. Automation is key because development is moving fast and we are outnumbered as security. We need to work together, right? And the only way to work together is through automation, okay? I know that I don't have much time left, so I'll just leave you with this. Just a few automation suggestions that you can start implementing today to work closer to development. First of all, leverage AWS data for automation. So AWS provides you with a great ton of metadata that can be helpful on your automations, such as tagging, if you're talking to instances, which subnet they're part of, what security groups. So it's leverage these data, right? Automatically apply runtime security to EC2 instances. AWS provides a great ton of tools that you can leverage today to help you automate deployment of security to EC2 instances. And also partner technologies like Trend Micro also leverage that, okay? So use that. I know that no one here is using Control Tower, which is not great for the next one, but if you are using CSPM technology, cloud security and portion management technology, if you're not, you should be, first of all. Second, one that is Control Tower aware, or at least aware of your environment, because AWS is pushing for atomic accounts, smaller accounts that is just hosting maybe a microservice. So we're going to have hundreds of AWS accounts in the next following months and years, right? So you need a technology that is aware of that and can give you visibility across all of them as soon as they are created. If you're leveraging Control Tower, even easier. And shift left security as much as possible. It doesn't matter if it is using container images, if you're using containers. So scanning your images, looking for vulnerabilities, secrets, malwares, all that before you put these images in productions as containers, and also scan your infrastructure as code. Most likely, your DevOps team is using some kind of infrastructure as code like CloudFormation, Terraform, ARM. They might be using something like that. And if they are, that's a perfect opportunity to automate security and compliance, because you can just look at a text file and really quickly point to, wait a minute, this here is not following the compliance that we need. This here is introducing a vulnerability to my environment because, I don't know, it's open port 22 to anyone in the world, right? So infrastructure as code, something that is really useful for developers, is also something really useful for you looking for vulnerabilities before committing them to production. That's pretty much it. Thank you so much. If you wanna send me a message later, we can have this conversation later for sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. We've got one more poll we're going to launch here to kind of wrap up. If you guys would take a moment to just kind of show us where you might fit on that spectrum. And I'll share a little bit of Trend Micro's path as we've adopted this model. So success in leveraging that DevOps model is really reliant on a culture shift. So Trend Micro, we actually became mission aligned a few years ago, top down from our CEO, to push this mindset across the organization. But it also started organically on its own as our developers have worked hard and furiously to bring new features to market. So as we've engaged more clients through the past few years, we work with customers who started fresh with new talent to fast track their program. Others have tasked traditional IT and security ops to be their change agent. And it's amazing to hear the stories of people who were just traditional IT folks without a dev background and what they've done to upskill themselves and future-proof their career. So we'd love to open it up to you, our participants, to hear a little bit about how you face this challenge and maybe take a few lessons learned from that challenge of when you introduce new things or change expectations. Staff can be, a little weary if they don't want to embrace change, and others may just jump into it with both feet. So for those of you who've started or well down the path or fully embraced, do you have any lessons learned for our community here on how to get the most out of new talent or upskilling your existing talent? And I know it's early and you may not have had enough coffee, but it's nice to see a number of folks are fully embrace. Brittany, if you could kind of share the results. I'm not sure if that's out there on everybody's screen. A few have not started, a number in the early stages. So we encourage you to just talk about questions or challenges or even little wins as you've seen your talent develop this mindset and really help scale your organization. So something maybe we can talk about or chat about in a break or over dueling pianos. Anybody have anything they'd like to share from a lesson learned or a challenge they're facing? All right. Well, we'll move on. Yes, go ahead, please.
Nick, from the trend side, I would say, if your organization is in that place where you haven't even started down this journey at all, don't be afraid at all to reach out to us, because I've had a couple of different customers that were in that place, and we're glad to kind of help you, get your head around, what this new world looks like and the kind of tools that you'll be using and things like that.
Great. Thanks, Nick. And if you have questions you want to just put into the chat, we could even follow up with you individually. I was working with Nick a while back as they went through new management change who had a new vision of adopting cloud, and the traditional folks we were working with were very hardware and data center centric. So we did a fast track sort of education program so that they could learn the terminology, they can get comfortable with what their personal development path may look like to really stay competitive in their new organization. So we just love talking tech and sharing ideas and lessons learned. So. All right, well, who's next on our agenda? I lost my slide for who's next, but I think it's Zach.
Yeah, absolutely. Give me just a second here. Let me share out my screen, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of these things over here on the cloud native application side. So I know you looked at a lot of these yesterday. We're going to specifically talk about container security and what we're doing today, but then what's even a little bit better, like what's coming down the road. So what are we looking at? And then I'm going to touch on application security for just a second, and then I'm actually going to turn it over to one of our sales engineers, and that has a great application security demo that he built for reInvent, so you can see kind of the actual application security stack in action and see what that might be able to mean for you in being able to implement there in your organization. So when we talk about cloud native applications, this is really, hey, we want to build something out going directly in the cloud using cloud native technologies and being able to leverage things for different reasons, right? So a lot of times this is, you're not going to have access to the whole operating system. And so while we still need to have the same kind of security pieces put in place, how we implement that's going to be different, right? So when it's going in and putting something around the ability to build it inside the pipeline, see what's there. We see a lot of organizations, one of the biggest challenges is the switch to Linux, right? As you switch over to most of the cloud native applications in an organization that might have been very Windows heavy, how do you do that, and how do you access the automation in those areas there? And security, especially in the cloud native application space, can start to slow things down. And that's one thing that we don't want to do. I like to, and I've been helping customers for over 7 years work in this DevOps transformational space, and we don't want security to be the person that says no. We want security to be the team that can say, yeah, absolutely, we can do that. How fast do you want to get that implemented? How fast do you want to get that deployed? Because we have tools that can help you do that. Like, we want to empower the security team to come to the table with the DevOps and be able to accelerate all those things that are there. So here's some of the big things that we're seeing and stuff that's out there. So with that, what do we do and how do we address that? So number one being on the container security side, and I'm sure you guys discussed this in the overview and some things yesterday. There's really two pieces that today are running right now. So we have the ability to, when a developer goes and they build out and they push it, it has to go through some sort of a build pipeline. There's a bunch of different tools, whether it's something that's built into the cloud provider, or they're using something like Jenkins or something that's there. And we can actually go in, we can do an image scan functionality through part of container security. And we can actually scan it. We can say, yep, hey, it's good. It meets our standards. We can go ahead and push it to the registry. And then once it goes to the registry, it can then get deployed onto the actual clusters that you want the containers pushed out to. And that's one piece, and that's really what we've been doing for a while. That technology that's there, that's built on a Trend Micro technology called Smart Check, and has been built up from there. Now, the new piece is the ability to actually also do what we call admission control. So before it goes to the actual cluster, there can be standards set inside container security saying, okay, it can't go and be put out there unless it has no critical vulnerabilities and only 2 high vulnerabilities based on our scanning functionality, right? So we can prevent vulnerable applications from being pushed out and being deployed out there on the different clusters that you have. Now, one of the big challenges is how do you do some of the real-time protection inside containers? And so that's some of the things that really want to come next. So what's being worked on in the container security space is using things like daemon set integration, so we can do some real-time protection without getting crazy in depth. And if you want to go look at some of the stuff in the functionality that we can do, we're leveraging heavily one of the technologies called eBPF, which and a lot of these I talk to don't have that much Linux experience, but think of it as kind of like a VM within your Linux kernel. So if you're familiar with TCP dump, that's actually a program using this eBPF module that's built within the Linux kernel, but it allows companies like Trend to be able to write our security stack and all of the technology that we have to actually interface with this built-in Linux kernel native fabric, if you will, to be able to look at things like actual kernel access, storage, networking. So all those functionality that's moving through that container in real time without having to install necessarily what you think of as a traditional agent, because we're writing everything to interface directly with the Linux commands and stuff that's in there. The other big thing looking at going down the road is things like drift detection. So once something's deployed, if somehow did it go through some different processes, and once we say, hey, this is what it looks like, or changes to vulnerabilities and things like that, depending on how you have your scans and everything set up, to be able to know if things have moved away from, okay, this is said it was safe at the time of deployment, it's drifted down, what's there, and how do we take possible actions on it, right? So those are what R&D is working on, wanting to bring out on the container security side soon. And then the other piece here on the application security. This is, I think, one of the biggest questions I've really gotten in probably the last 12 months is, okay, my DevOps team just came over and they said they're doing Azure Functions. They want to do Lambda. They want to do all these things that I have absolutely no clue. I hear serverless, I hear this, and I don't know what that means, right? This is literally, it's 2 lines of code in most cases. We basically inject a security library into the application that they're building. So this is going to harden from things like SQL injections and a lot of the things that you're used to needing to protect, maybe through like a traditional IPS or something like that inside the data center, but being able to inject it directly into the different programming languages, right? So between PHP or Python or Java, going in and actually putting this code in the security library in, you're able to harden, and you can turn on a lot of functionality, turn it off. And I know Jacob's going to show us some of that here in a second. So this is really, it helps protect from the things that we know about, right? And turning on things like SQL injections and things like this. But there is also some really advanced stuff in here that, well, when you turn on something like SQL injection, hey, it's going to match all the known regular expressions. There is some smart intelligence in there. So knowing that when something is formatted a certain way, if there's an unknown SQL injection that goes in, there's some intelligence to try to detect that, and because it knows that the type of data that's being input into this application isn't correct, and can actually throw those exceptions and block that traffic in some intelligent ways outside of what just a traditional IPS. So it's kind of merging a couple different pieces of technology and the ability to do all those different things out there. And the other piece that this is, I've had some customers really implementing this in, is on the container security for real-time protection. We can use the Cloud One workload security if you have access to the base nodes inside the clusters, which is kind of like the base machine, and then all the containers run on top of it in the container cluster that you're running. Well, every cloud service provider has different stacks, like in AWS, it's called Fargate, where you can run all your containers with essentially they're stateless, right? You're not having to manage the underlying infrastructure of the containers, you just run the container. Well, in that, not having access to the based host nodes and those operating systems, being able to do real-time security today can be challenging until the daemon set functionality. So you can use, depending on what your application is written in, you could even take application security and add it in to your container and build this natively into that application, in a sense, if you had something that isn't going to have access to that host node. So hopefully that gave you maybe some different ways you could apply this, some of the things that are coming. And then I'm actually going to go ahead and toss it over to Jacob to be able to see application security and make sure he has enough time to really show you how powerful it is.
Great. Before Jacob jumps in on there, Zach, I know we've done a number of these workshops, and I zeroed in on something you said there. Frictionless security, 2 lines of code. So as Jacob gets ready to set this up, you talked about a lot of systems, a lot of components, a lot of functions. We're always walking that tightrope of enabling the business and security. But with 2 lines of code, you're saying we we can add these controls, but not get in the way of the way our developers work. What's the average time? Say, I remember we've been at a session where they put a QR code up for all the participants and they were able to grab the trial of this. What's the average time you've seen a dev team needing to take to invest in getting this stood up to actually see it in action?
I mean, minimal. And one of the great things that's so different is leveraging so many pieces that make it the ability to scan, and with dev test and all those different segments. It's very easy for a dev team to create a fork of their application, add the security library and do the testing, all the sanity pieces going, yeah, hey, it doesn't break our stuff, great. And then they can push it to production. And I've seen it in as quick as a day. Usually it's closer, and that's for a very, very highly evolved organization, but usually within a week to 2 weeks. For organizations that have been doing some of this and have an okay DevOps practice going on. But then even going into some that haven't really had any experience, it's still a very quick way to do this because it doesn't take a whole lot of pieces there. And, one of the things that I don't know if it's been mentioned yesterday, the reality is that we have to look at and admit is the fact that 95% of the code, even more than that we're running is not stuff that our DevOps teams are actually writing. We're using all of these open source libraries and all these great pieces that are out there to be able to create very, very quick iterations of what's there, but 95% of that code not being ours. And I know Snyk's going to touch on this in a little bit, making sure that it's patched and it's secure in that container build process, but it's also, all these other pieces of how do you harden that code when you're not, you can't always be 100% trustworthy of where it's coming from if you didn't write it in-house.
Great. Thanks. So on to the next step. Let's see it in action.
Hey guys, thanks for having me here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Like Zach said, I'm going to be showing you guys application security today. So let me just find the right screen here. All right.
Yep.
All right. So are you seeing my application? I'm on a VM on my Mac because I have a test virus I have to use and my Mac will block it. So
yeah, we're good, Jacob.
Everyone can see my screen, right? Okay, perfect. All right. So I'm going to show you a little bit about the source code because I want to just touch on how easy this is to implement. Like they alluded to, it's really just a couple lines of code, right? And what I'm doing here is I have a Docker container. I got this application from another trender. I just forked it on GitHub and I threw it into my environment. This is sitting on a Ubuntu server and AWS, and it has Docker on it, right? So I have a couple layers of protection. I have application security, and I have workload security running on my server as well. So it's inspecting that container traffic east to west, north to south, and I can go in there and I can block IP addresses in the firewall if I wanted to as well. So I just like having that out there. If I wanted to, I could build this application and push it to my ECR, and then I could pull that container and throw it into like ECS or something like that, and then we're serverless, right? So just it's a lot. It's easy to do. So right here is where you're looking at that one line of code for the agent right here. This is the jar. That's the actual agent that's going to protect this application, and then I have my application and my key and my secret, right? So if you wanted to implement this, it would be super simple. You would just come over here, you'd grab your key and your secret, you plug it into your application and deploy it. All right, so this is the Cloud One user interface that you're looking at. This is the application right here that you see. So I'm gonna do a couple malicious things to it, and I'm gonna show you in real time how I'm, one, notified on Slack, and two, it shows up on the console itself. So if I just do a simple SQL injection, and if you're not familiar with SQL injection, what it's trying to do is trying to manipulate the data in the database, right? To try and steal some information or passwords or stuff like that. So this is one of the more popular attacks you'd see on an application like this. So that's why I chose to use this. So if I tried to sign in, right, it's gonna say your request has been blocked. And in addition to that, it's gonna show up here. I was under attack in the last hour because I was doing some testing, but it's actually gonna pop up and show red that I'm currently under attack right now. And I'm also going to be notified on Slack. So you can see right here, I'm under attack. This is my IP address, right? So if I want to dig into this a little bit, I can come into here and I can see the actual attack that was used on my application, right? So we see the general SQL injection prevention. I see the host name of my EC2 instance, the port, and then the source address where the attack came from. And then in addition to that, I can actually see the payload that existed, right? Well, this has a little bit more data in it, but this follows the command that I ran as the SQL injection. And it gives you all these good insights on the CVE score or the CVS score, CVEs right here for you to go in and do some investigation on this. In addition to that, I'm going to also show you if I were a developer, right? In my previous life, I worked at IBM and I was a DevOps engineer. So we collaborated a lot over Slack between the teams because I support like full stack engineers and I pretty much just automate everything for them. So that way it would, do that, the frictionless deployment, as you want to call it, the CI/CD, I'd continuously integrate and deploy for them. We collaborate over Slack, right? So I have my own little Slack channel I created here, and this is actually delivering me real time. As soon as my application's attacked, I get a notification on my Slack channel that someone's attacking me. So I thought that was super cool to be able to do that, and that's also super easy, right? If I come over here and I go to integrations, you have a few options. You have Slack, PagerDuty, Insights, and Amazon SNS. I chose Slack just because I'm on there more, and I love the idea of collaborating and bridging that gap between developers and operations and security, right? So it's just cool to be able to do that. I'm going to do another attack here, and this is I found it as another cool one to do, but I have to sign in for this one, so sign in. Now, say I had some type of website, right, that I wanted to upload stuff, which is a pretty common thing these days. So maybe images or text files, anything it might be. So I'm going to try and upload a malicious file, right? It's just an iCar file. This is a trend. I just got it from a website from Trend. It's a fake, but it will flag as malicious, right? So I'm going to try and upload this, and I'm going to get blocked right away. So we're also going to get real-time visibility into this one, and I'll kind of dive into exactly. It's going to show the exact file that I tried to upload in the virus, and I'm getting notified on Slack again as we speak here. So let's see if it's in here yet. Yeah, it may take just a couple minutes. There it is. Just popped in. So now we're going to go take a look, right? We're going to go in here, and we're going to see, once again, the host name, my IP address, the source of the attacker, and then the actual virus name, followed by the file name as well. So the one thing I really like to leverage, I love application security. I think it's by far one of the smoothest and good looking applications. Like a first glance at this and it's just like, wow, I really think customers would really like this if they're in this space. But so the other great thing too, you're getting real-time visibility. So that's another thing I really like here. But I'm going to take a peek at the policies real quick. I'm not going to go in too deep here because there is a lot of information here. But as you can see, you have the ability to mitigate all these, right? Or you can just do a report, which is basically just logging them and not necessarily blocking them. So if you come in here, I'm just going to give you an idea of how in-depth Trend has built this. If you can see all these rules, there's 5 pages of this stuff. So it's just incredible. I pretty much have everything on that pertains to my application. But as you can see here, there's a ton of different things. Some of the more popular ones would be remote command execution, SQL injection, obviously a malicious file upload for applications like mine, but also IP protection, right? So if I didn't have this running in workload security, I could go in here and block attackers by the IP address right from application security instead of going to my server, configuring my firewall to block him as well. So, and then down here, you also get the ability to customize the message that appears when something is blocked. So if you remember, you see request has been blocked, we detected unusual activity. I can customize this, add some color, things like that to really fine tune the way things look. The other thing I was going to show was my Lambda, how I protect my Lambda function, but I ran into some issues with permissions on it, so I'm not able to show it. But just keep in mind that this is just as easy to implement into a Lambda function, right? I know Trend has fantastic documentation. I was able to follow it and set it up within an hour. This application itself, too, I set this up in little to no time. Thanks to a couple trenders who pointed me in the right direction as well. But just to go along with the whole DevOps model, I deploy this with a DevOps model, right? I have Jenkins running up here. I have Smart Check Scan. So this is all integrated right into my DevOps process. Like I said, you could wrap this up, you could push this to a ECR, and then boom, you could have Jenkins or any deployment server go grab that and deploy it to your server. So that's pretty much all I have. I don't know if anyone has any questions or anything. I think I touched on everything I wanted to show, but yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and is this one problem that I hear customers talk about a lot is, the difficulty of decrypting traffic to inspect it. This kind of solves part of that problem by putting the inspection on the other side of that, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Great. Thank you, Jacob. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We're happy to follow up individually with any of you after this and go deeper with you or your teams just on a informational perspective. So I think next up we have Jamie O'Meara with Snyk.
Very good. Yep. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen here and we'll get started. All right. All right. Hopefully we can see that. Just confirmation.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate your time today. My name is Jamie O'Meara. So I'm a global solution architect with Snyk, and there's my Twitter handle. And one of the things I want to talk to you a little bit about today is kind of end-to-end application security and the partnership between Trend Micro and Snyk and how it helps kind of cover that full software development lifecycle. I think we would all probably agree, probably one of the most profound things that has really changed the way that software is built is the use of open source code. And it hasn't just obviously been recently. I mean, it's been over a 25-year time frame. But what's interesting about open source, in my opinion, is there's some inherent benefits for businesses because it allows you to build applications and reach market faster, as a lot of the messages that we looked at today show, right? And in doing so, what it helps you do is reduce the number of lines of code that you have to write. So for example, a simple application could be as simple as 3 lines of code or 3 files and 80 lines of code. And then when you combine that with the dependencies and the transitive dependencies that come from the open source community, what you see is this explosion of the amount of lines of code that are actually part of that application, but majority of that coming from outside in the open source community and the communities that build applications for you. So this presents an interesting risk to an organization with 80%, in some cases almost to 90% of the code coming from outside your organization. It's also where most of the vulnerabilities have really grown over the last 5 years, because as these communities come into play, they become very popular with the developers. Developers start writing them. And what you typically have over time is you get code that tends to get bit rot. It will sit in and be, it'll be built initially. And then over time, as it's not maintained as much, it really becomes, it just kind of sits in your inventory, kind of rots over time. But at Snyk, when we talk about this, and I think you've kind of seen this a lot with the presentations today, is we talk about shift left, and there's really a shift right, shift left. And that's really the great thing about the partnership between Snyk and Trend Micro. But at Snyk, when we look at shift left, it's not just good enough to push your tools up to the left-hand side and say, now developers, you are responsible for security, because it's a very challenging time for them. They're still trying to build features. They're trying to, go through that innovation cycle and deliver new code and new features downline. So we can't just push it up there. So we need a different way of doing that. We need some way of doing continuous security and helping the developer. So what we want to do is empower them with the tools and the ownership to be able to scale. And the way that you do that is you build right into their developer tool chain to make that easy. On the flip side, we need to be able to also use the security teams, the AppSec teams, to help support developers to own that security and make it easy for them. I think that if you can automate that process and you make it easy for them, the chance of them being able to accept and pull that in as part of their daily routine becomes a lot easier. I think the other kind of shift that you see is really around the software supply chain. So as more customers start to use cloud native, you'll start to see the supply chain and the way things are done. So at the very top, of course, we talk about our custom code, and that's maybe 20 to 10% of what we write. Underneath that, really what we don't see is where that open source comes. So, and I had mentioned 80% of that code base actually coming from the open source, and with 80% of the vulnerabilities coming in those indirect dependencies. Then there's also the shift to containerization. So as more customers containerize their workload and move them to the cloud, that also introduces a different way of building the image that's going to run in production, but also the maintenance that goes behind that image and the security vulnerabilities that then are associated with that container image. And of course, I think you'll see when you make that shift to the cloud, there's the infrastructure as code. So these are all new files that get created to help us deploy our application and consume the infrastructure and to codify that so that we can to deliver that to production. But in doing so, we have a tendency to have a lot of misconfigurations around the infrastructure as it moves. And then, of course, when we're looking at the custom code that we do build and to some of the challenges that we want to be able to resolve, we need to be able to kind of scan that, not have it take hours, and provide feedback to the developers for the things that they do build so that they become very aware of building good practices in the way that they write their code. From a cloud native perspective, and as we move to containerizations, if you really looked at the pre-cloud era, developers were just focusing on app code and the open source libraries. All of the rest of the stuff kind of in blue was managed for them by IT. But you see this shift as we move to the cloud native era. Now, not only are they responsible for the code that they write and the open source libraries that they pull in or the frameworks that they rely on, but now they may become responsible for the cloud services, and that may just be configuring that cloud service. Their developers now become responsible for those container images, not just the creating them, but maintaining them over time and having automation built so that they can create new ones and deliver those to production to help fill vulnerable attacks on those container images. Depending on what kind of applications they write, if they really go into the microservice architectures, adding in mesh networks for those services to talk to each other and the policies that go around that. And then, of course, really the consumption of some of the resources that are exposed by the Kubernetes API, so secrets and that kind of stuff, are things that get put in as part of the infrastructure as code when you deliver your application to production. And then in putting that right next to the application or as part of the application. So those things are very important as you move into a cloud native era. And this is really where Snyk and Trend Micro come together, right? So securing the whole process through the software development lifecycle, as we've kind of mentioned in the DevOps world. So Snyk on the left-hand side is really trying to empower developers with the tools to be able to scale security. We want to provide a tremendous amount of automation, because the more automation you can put into it that developers trust, the better the chances that those vulnerabilities and licensing issues will be fixed. And then, of course, pushing that even further up into their development environment. So if they want to be able to look at that information in the IDE, so as they're developing local on their laptop, they may be looking at the code that they're writing, and Snyk may be telling them, hey, the way that you've written this code, there are better patterns to use to make it more secure. You also may say, hey, the developers pulled in certain dependencies for their application. Capturing that information up in the IDE before they even start to push the source code down into this developer toolchain is a great opportunity for them to capture and modify that, generating that fast feedback loop early in that development process. As the code kind of enters into the developer toolchain, then also performing additional checks as we continue to move it closer and closer to production. On the flip side, of course, we have kind of more of the shift right approach, and that's where the partnership's really good between Snyk and Trend. Is that obviously we've seen some demonstrations of Trend's ability at the operational perspective and how to help protect those vulnerabilities as they make their way into production and hopefully get fixed before they get there. And then we all kind of meet here in the middle around Trend Smart Check, which I'll show in a demonstration a little bit later today, how Snyk open source vulnerability data and the information that's provided there can become very valuable and beneficial for the developer and how they fix those issues before they make it to production. So just real quick, if you haven't heard of Snyk before, we were founded just about a little over 5 years ago. We've raised $450 million. We have 1.5 million developers using our products today. And most importantly, we are really helping a lot of large and small, medium business organizations change the way that they kind of move to a DevSecOps world and providing a level of automation around that. So what's kind of our unique approach to doing this? Well, as I've kind of mentioned, we want to be able to empower those developers. So the whole focus and the whole vision of Snyk is to do this from a developer first friendly tooling perspective. So integrating it where the developers work, the chances of them using it and taking the advice and automating it and fixing their code goes up tremendously when it's part of the developer tool chain that they use today. In our opinion, this is where we get the scale, and that's what we've seen with our early customers that have moved down this path. Automation around this is very, very important. So, we always talk about actionability. When I discover these things, what can I do to resolve the issue, and in what ways can I automate that? And then for Snyk in general, security depth, right? So the coverage of our Snyk Intel proprietary database, the speed at which we deliver this information, and keeping the number of false positives low is important, because if developers don't trust the information, the chance of them doing anything with it are probably minimal. So again, as I mentioned, this is why this is important to us, right? And if I think from a customer's perspective is where it's really important, right? It's enabling that end-to-end application security through the DevOps lifecycle, where Trend is protecting the application runtime, and Snyk combined with Trend is figuring out how to fix those vulnerabilities at the source before they actually make their way into production. And we'll kind of go through this a little bit in detail, because I'll show this through the demo, which will be coming up shortly. But this is kind of what the CI/CD pipeline looks like. And if you start on the far left, when we get into coding, this is where developers are maybe writing something local on their laptop, but they're really trying to build a level of confidence with what they've built from a coding perspective to basically check that in and commit it to typically like a Git repository. So up in the coding aspect, we provide a number of tools for testing and fixing vulnerabilities and licensing issues. And soon our Snyk code will also help them with the code that they write and providing feedback on patterns that provide more security in the code that they are writing. But once a developer is really comfortable with what they've written, they start that process and that journey to be able to check it into the repository. And this, in doing so, this is introducing that code into the developer tool chain for all teammates and everybody with an interest in the code to be able to see. And around that process is where you could provide a lot of the automation for the things that you're about to check in. So for example, can I see to make sure that the developer, before I take that pull request, did they introduce any licenses that go against our policy? Did they introduce any new vulnerabilities that didn't exist before? And kind of what level are they at? As you continue to move through the Git, you kind of generate the build and the binary artifacts. And as we go through that process, we want to be able to scan those too, right? And this is where Snyk and Trend really come together. As developers build the binaries, then the next thing they typically build is a container image. And we're looking at that information because these are the things that are going to eventually make their way to production. And that's what we want to make sure does not contain vulnerabilities that expose a certain amount of risk as we move further right into the shift right operations in the runtime. So whether that's a traditional virtual machine that gets put in, whether it's something that goes on a physical machine, if it's a really older application, or whether it's moved into a container image or even serverless, we need this runtime protection for developers and the applications as they move into operations. So just real quick, a little insight about the Snyk Intel database at its core. So it's a pretty well trusted database within the industry, and I think you can kind of see that from where we play in this space. And it's important because the information that's provided in there is very comprehensive, right? So we want to be able to cover as much of the landscape and the ecosystems as possible. So not just focusing on a certain number. We also need that information to be very timely. That's super important when doing these things. A 0 day that comes into play, how does that get bubbled to the top for the developer to prioritize that in their work effort? And then of course, accuracy I think is always very important because low false positives really build trust within the developer that the information that they are presented will not take them down a rabbit hole and waste their time on something that maybe turned out to really not be an issue. And I'll go through these in the demonstration, or talk a little bit more about them in the demonstration. But what we see with a lot of customers is they start to onboard their applications into Snyk. You get to a situation where you realize, wow, as I have more of my application on there, more of my applications on there, and my inventories there, I really need to figure out what is the prioritization. What should I be tackling first? And that's exactly what our instant prioritization, or our prioritization score, really looks at. What is the vulnerability that we're looking at? What is the overall score of it? Is it fixable? How many of these things are actually fixable? And kind of what is the maturity exploit around that particular vulnerability? In addition, what we try to do for developers is also let them know, it's one thing to do at the package level, but as you open up the individual open source packages and you get to the different methods that exist in there, how much of those are actually reachable? That can also drive your prioritization score. While we know that the package has a vulnerability, am I actually calling functions within there that would cause me to be able to up the prioritization for that vulnerability? And I think from an AppSec perspective, someone who's responsible for the complete inventory and looking at that, this is really where we get into governance at scale. So having an overall status on your security. So how many issues do I have? How many of those are high severity, medium, and low? Which ones are fixable? Driving this prioritization and having a kind of a global view across your application inventory is very important. Of course, then you also have the licensing issues. I know that most customers will have kind of a whitelist issue of, hey, these are the license policies or the licenses that we accept from the open source community. But as developers are finding new communities and new ways of doing things, or maybe new languages, for example, some of those licenses may not be on there. And introducing those into the development process can, as you move closer to production, can slow things down, as legal needs to review those types of things. So having these checks in places as developers are committing code and having the policy in place is super helpful. Of course, we always want to make things very actionable for the developer. So when we discover these vulnerabilities, or we discover maybe a problem with a license, identifying that so the developer knows earlier in the process than waiting to the point where they actually want to release the code. The other thing is around the dependency health. So as you have a larger set of application inventory, you start loading it on here, some of those open source communities slowly kind of start to deprecate things, or they move to new ways of doing things, or sometimes they just completely go away. So being able to track that dependency health and to understand what's been deprecated and where that impact is in my application inventory and what things I might need to address helps from a planning perspective and overall tracking and identification. And then, of course, providing policy at the license level. I kind of mentioned this a little bit, but making that fully customizable and understanding what licenses are accepted within your organization on a global scale are always one of the things that we end up tackling with a lot of customers. All right, so I'm going to jump into a quick demonstration of open source, Snyk open source with Trend Micro Deep Security Smart Check. But I just want to kind of give you a little feeling for what you're going to see here. So just so you kind of have a flow of an understanding of the demo. So I'm going to start with Deep Security Smart Check, and I'm going to kind of show you how, from a developer's perspective, they may use the tool, and then that they actually end up working backwards. So they identify that some of these vulnerabilities may exist on maybe an existing application that they haven't necessarily loaded into Snyk yet. And then we're going to load that. They're going to load that application into Snyk so that they can go back and say, how do I resolve some of these open source vulnerabilities? And then I'll jump into a little bit about reporting and policy management. Okay. All right, so I have a container image that I've already created. The container image was actually created through a GitHub action. So as a developer, I may have pushed my application in there, which part of that pipeline was to go ahead and build the container image for me. So I step into the container image itself, and I won't go into great detail about all of these different pieces because some of the trend folks would probably do a much better job with it than I will. But one thing that I think is always very important is to understand the layers of your container image and to be able to see which layers are good and from a security perspective. And of course, you can kind of go in and see some of the places where there might be a potential for some malware and some discovery. But what I'm really interested in from the Trend Micro and the Snyk perspective is around the vulnerability scans. So as a developer, I may come in and look at the most critical vulnerabilities in my application. And for me, fortunately, the container image did represent and did show that I had a pretty critical vulnerability for that container image. I can go look at it, some details from Snyk, so I can understand a little bit more about this. So I can obviously see the CVS score over here, how the attack vector is, the complexity, what kind of things would be needed to be able to perform this vulnerability. Of course, some of the CVE and some CWE information as well. But what I'm really interested in, maybe from a developer's perspective, is some of the details behind this. So what is kind of the overview? Because as a developer, I'm the one that probably introduced this vulnerability in based on the version that I've chosen for my application, as well as some information on how to address this from a developer's perspective. Most importantly, though, when I get down to the bottom here, I'm looking for something very actionable. And what I can see is that I do have a remediation, and that remediation is to upgrade this particular package to version 1.3.3 or higher to resolve this vulnerability. With that said, if I go over to Snyk and if I've already imported my application, or if I import it after the fact, after I've looked at what was discovered in my container image, I can get down to the source code, right? So this is where I want to identify and fix things at the source level. This particular application does have three individual binaries that get created. Knowing this, I actually know that that particular issue sits in this binary that will be created for me. So if I go look for upload, I can actually find that vulnerability that exists and how it was introduced. So this is, if I go look at the priority score, I realize that this does have a fix. It is the vulnerability that I just looked up from deep code, and the priority score is pretty high because it does have a fix. If I go down a little bit further, I can see how it was introduced. So this tells me which of the direct dependencies introduced that, and I can see that it was fixed in this version. Now, the beauty of this is I can also look at some more of the detail. I can go back down to the bottom here, which would say, hey, take me back to the Snyk page so I can learn more about it. But since I've already been there, the most logical step here is to start thinking about how do I fix this vulnerability, knowing that there's a fix. But let's say as a developer, I don't necessarily know the tool as well. I also have this ability to go over to this dependency tree because, as I mentioned, the direct dependency was actually, we'll pull that one up again. The direct dependency is actually, so this is the top level. This is one of the indirect dependencies. And then of course, here is where that vulnerability actually sits. So I now have this tree to figure out which specific dependency is introducing that. And Snyk also backs that up by showing it to you on the individual cards when I was up here looking at this. So this is the introduced through, which is that top level one. And this is the library that it was introduced in. So the choice that I have as a developer's perspective is I can say, oh, let me go ahead and fix this vulnerability. In doing so, what this does is it kicks off the developer workflow. And what it's really doing is it's now interacting with that Git repository to say, let's create a pull request for this. You could go through this point. These are all the vulnerabilities that exist for this with fixes. You could go through this workflow this way, but it's a very kind of manual process. And it's great if you just want to fire off individual ones or if you're just coming into Snyk. But I'm going to go ahead and back out of this because what I really want to do is jump over to that repository. And I want to look at the pull requests. Because what Snyk can do for you is actually generate the fixes that are available, because we talked about actionable and automated. And it will list out that if I am willing to, or if I can, start upgrading this process, I can fix some of the vulnerabilities that existed, which in this case would be the same one that we just went through. And from a developer's perspective, I never even have to leave my tool chain. I can come in here and I can see the same set of information that was available in the Snyk UI in here. So I can see the severity of what it was. I can see the priority score. I can actually click and link myself to that issue. And then I can see whether it has any known exploit, mature exploits. And in doing so, the other thing that is great about this developer workflow is it will start to kick off all of those processes as a developer that I need to know that if I check this in, that I would be, this would not break my build, and it would allow me to move it even further into the testing phase. So what's great about this is if you use something like GitHub and GitHub Actions, is not only can I test the build to make sure it would build, I could also start running all of my tests to validate that it's not just a binary issue, but it also passes and doesn't break the user functionality of my application. And of course, we also do license checks. So at this point, if I was satisfied with everything running and getting the check marks that I want, I would actually just go ahead and do a very common developer workflow that I'm used to, and that is just generate this merge pull request, which would introduce the change that is here in my file changes, which is basically just going to the package manager file and upgrading it to the version that resolves the issue. Okay, so real quick, just to give you a little perspective too, as you start to pull in these projects and you start to work with it, we have, oops, let me go here. We have the integration page. And so one of the things that's always important to make this automation and very actionable is to ingrain the processes of your organization with the developer tool chains that you use and the tools basically. So in this case, if these are the typical source control repositories that we have that developer workflow in. So whether you're using GitHub or GitLab or on-premise or Bitbucket, we ingrain all of the developer workflow that I just shared in GitHub and all of these different Git products. We do the same thing from a container registry perspective. So if you want to be able to scan containers from a continuous integration perspective. So as your application moves from development to test to staging or to Q&A to staging, and then finally into production, being able to capture snapshots of the application as it moves from a vulnerability and license perspective is available. And so we plug in at that level as well. And then I had mentioned the IDEs, plugging into the IDEs so developers can make good decisions further up in the development process before it actually moves down the developer toolchain. And then we do have notifications to also pull that information in. Real quick, I just have a few minutes left. I do want to go through the reporting just to make you aware of what's available from a reporting perspective. If you're an AppSec a person responsible for AppSec, you're going to want to understand, the number of high severities that you have and how many are actually fixable. Again, medium and low severity and what's fixable. Same thing from a licensing perspective. And you're really kind of tracking issues over time. So as an organization, are we getting better? Are we seeing our vulnerability counts go up, or are we seeing them down? And are we seeing developers, kind of fixing those issues? Also, from a overall issues perspective, we can list the issue information differently. So if there's certain packages that you want to go, maybe a 0 day comes out, it's very high, and you want to see where it impacts your overall application inventory, you can come in here and you can actually search by that. So I could see that, for example, this one has a high, or doesn't have a high priority score. This one down here actually has a pretty high priority score. It's remote code execution. And then I could see the projects that it's actually in and how mature that is. So I can, this really helps me identify those projects where I want to be able to tackle this, having a very large view across my application inventory. And then finally, I just want to touch briefly on the dependencies. So this lists out all the dependencies within your organization. You can get a pretty good understanding of, the last version that came out, how long ago it was. I mean, some of these, 15 years ago, it's a little crazy, but it's actually used in 30 different projects within my organization. So it helps me start to understand some of the issues that might be related to that bit rot that I had mentioned, especially from a vulnerability perspective. And with that, I think that's all I really had today. So if there were any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Thanks, Jamie. Any questions for Jamie here? As we wrap this one up, I want to say great overview and demo. And for those of you who know me, I'm a bit of a statistics junkie. And Jamie, I really liked your survey data on who should own security and that follow-on statement that security is a major constraint on an organization's ability to deliver software quickly. So Brittany's loaded a little poll so that we can see where our audience stands on those same two questions. And as you take a look at that poll, I'd just like to add that whether it's Trend Micro, Snyk, or a combination of other tools that you may have in your arsenal, the commonality really here is that all of us, no matter where we stand in the security space or services space, we're mission aligned to helping increase your security posture. So looks like we're spot on. We're a little higher. It says 83% of people say developers should own security. And Jamie, I think you had 81 on your other slide.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And on
Numbers match.
The second one, developers should own security, but are not well equipped to do so. 33%, I think, was on your original slide, and right now we're tracking in at about 83% of our participants saying that rings true in their organization.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Great. So thanks for giving us your feedback on those polls. And I have to apologize, I'm in a presenter mode. So Brittany, you can throw those results up there whenever you feel, oh, they're changing a little bit here at the end on the second one. It's getting closer to Jamie's slide. But we're blazing through our agenda here. And I believe we've got Raf coming back center stage. So feel free to post any other questions in there. I know I'm a broken record, but Jamie, thanks. I personally was looking for the fall leaves sort of colors presentation that you gave to our sales team a while back. How's that backyard? You get all those leaves raked up yet?
I did, yes. It was very painful.
All right, we'll save that one for a follow-on session. But moving on back to Raf, we're going to look a little bit at file storage security.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be back here, central stage. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Cloud One file storage security. And I know that we discussed it briefly earlier today with Zach, but I'll deep dive a little bit into the details. As you probably saw from my first presentation, I like to set the stage. So before talking about file storage security per se, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Amazon S3 is and why it's important to have a different kind of approach for this kind of environment, right? And I'm sorry if you're familiar with S3 and you're using that every day. Just make sure that everybody's on the same page, okay? So bear with me for a moment if you're familiar with S3. So Amazon S3, it's an object storage service, okay? So it offers, if you read its documentations, you're going to see the highlights on scalability, data availability, security, and performance, okay? So pretty much you're leveraging storage to AWS, so you are dealing with less responsibility, right? It's finally tuned for access control. So again, every now and then we hear about data leak that happened because an S3 bucket was left public and encrypted, etc., etc. We know the drill by now. But you are not going to find a single data leak because S3 wasn't coded properly or you name it, right? It's usually on the customer side of things. And it offers 11 nines of durability. So as long as you put a file there, 99.9999999% of a chance that the file is going to remain there, right, over time. So if you look at the shared responsibility model, and if you haven't, you probably should if you're leveraging cloud providers, you're going to see that S3 is really high on the shared responsibility model because like I mentioned before, you're leveraging AWS to pretty much do everything. You just need to care about your data and how you're managing control to your data, right? So it's a cheap storage with low maintenance. So why not, right? And if you look at any deployment in S3, it most probably is leveraging S3 in some fashion, right? It's either CloudFront websites, serverless applications that need to store some data somewhere, backup, migration, CloudFormation, Lambda deployment. All that is leveraging S3 as a layer to offer the service. And if you have your development team working on application S3, they probably are using a combination of those, and therefore they're using S3, right? So it's important. So as of right now, we know that, okay, it's important to look at S3 because we have our internal customers using S3. But it's also important to understand that S3 isn't a file system, okay? You cannot install Linux, Windows, any application in S3. You access S3 through the graphical user interface, through the CLI, through HTTPS requests / its API, right? So different ways to access it, but none of them is mounting as a file system on your computer, okay? Or on an EC2 instance. So it clearly becomes a challenge to protect it, right? Because there is no OS, we cannot install an agent, right? It's higher on the shared responsibility model. That's good, as in I want to use it because I'm leveraging somebody else to handle the boring part, but also it provides us with less opportunities to protect the bucket, right? And because traditionally AV hooks to the operational system I/O, and like I mentioned before, there is no way to deploy an agent to S3, right? Even if there was, there wouldn't be a way to hook to the I/O, okay? And if you try to protect the data on the consumer side of things, you might not always have access to the consumer. So for instance, let's say that you have an EC2 instance that is downloading files from S3 and pushing files to S3. Yeah, sure, you might be able to to install an AV on that EC2 instance, and you should be okay. But most probably than not, you're leveraging this S3 to deliver files to your customers, to your partners, and you don't have control from these environments, right? On these environments. So you cannot deploy security on your customers or partners, consumers, okay? So you must, whatever solution you come up with, it needs to integrate into the application flow, right? So it's not just like a laptop or server where the flow is pretty much user clicking buttons and that triggers an I/O, and then the AV is going to scan a file. There are complex flows that one application might be writing on the bucket, and as soon as the file is wrote there, another application, another microservice might be reading that data, that it might be transferred to a partner, then it might come back. So whatever solution come up with cannot interfere with what your developers already have set in place for this application flow, right? So that means that it must allow result handling. Okay, so let's say you're working for a bank, and then whenever your customers send a file, maybe a PDF file to prove that they paid something or something like that, the file is written to an S3 bucket, right? Now let's say that you detected this file has a malware. How cool would that be that you can go back to your customer and say, hey, Mr. Customer, you probably have malware on your computer. So we're going to offer you to, scan your computer, whatever. And at the same time, the backend, you're going to set a flag on that account as possible. This customer possibly had a cyber attack on their computer, so we should probably disconnect all their accounts from the system, right? Or we need to go over a review of this customer. So whatever solution you come up with shouldn't break the flow and should allow result handling so you can build on top of that. And of course, it must work with AWS S3 API because there is no opportunity to intercept at the IO level, either disk IO or network level, right? So it must work with Amazon S3 API. So if you're, again, new with S3, let's see some examples from Trend Micro customers, how they are leveraging our solution nowadays. But let's show the use case first. So this company here, they have a Lambda file, a Lambda function, that once per day goes to a partner environment and download a file and write this file to an S3 bucket, okay? And then every single person on the sales department, every single person's computer on the sales department automatically, again, once per day, goes fetch this file and download to the computer, right? So everyone on the sales department have that running on their computers. So that's pretty much a way to keep the sales list, if I'm not mistaken, updated across every single salesperson. But once the partner that is offering the file actually was attacked and the file was replaced with malware. So they are unaware of the fact, this Lambda download the malware, pushed to the S3 bucket, and of course later all the computers in the sales department downloaded the malware and executed the malware on their computers, right? So that was an actual challenge that they went through, and because of that, they came to us to discuss how to improve their security posture in S3. Another customer of ours, this one is more related to brand protection. So whenever there is a big event, they have these huge trucks with massive antennas pointing to the sky. They are recording live the event. They push everything through satellites back to their AWS accounts. To be more specific, the images are dropped in S3 buckets. And no matter if you're using a TV or a phone or a computer, if you're using their app to stream the game or the event, you are receiving data straight from their S3 bucket. So they want to make sure that they are just streaming good data, good images from the event, nothing else. So they were worried about how they can protect this data to protect their brand, right? And you probably saw that already or something similar to that. And some of our customers actually had something similar implemented, right? They are trying to create their own way to scan for malware, scan these buckets for malware, right? And usually they come up with a solution similar to this one. They're leveraging an open source AV, probably Clan AV, which that's not the issue here. The issue is that these homemade solutions, it kind of works, right? They are scanning their files for malware. Problem is that it kind of works. It isn't a solution that is cloud native. So despite the challenge, however, they go with it because they don't have anything better to use, or at least they didn't, right? So they probably have a bunch of S3 buckets. Whenever a new file is dropped, that sends a message to a SQS queue. And then they have an auto-scale group of EC2 instances that are scanning these files as they are dropped, right? And whenever anything's found, they push that to an SNS topic that could potentially send an email or do something else, maybe delete the file, quarantine the file. Issue here though is if customer is using Amazon S3, sorry, to be on a higher position on the shared responsibility model. So they don't need to worry about patching, installing software, configuring network, or anything like that. The moment that they decide, okay, cool, but we need to protect these files, these buckets against malware, and that's the only solution we can come up with, they are now using EC2 instances, right? They are now installing software, updating OS, configuring network. All that they decided was they're going to leave behind to use the S3 model. Now they are back, right? So yeah, sure, it works, but you are, first of all, it's expensive to run EC2 instance compared to everything else here. And second, you're dealing with indirect expense such as patching your environment, something that you didn't have to do if you're using a cloud native approach, right? So like I said, still leverage EC2 instances and machines, which isn't great. Operation overhead to keep updated, expensive to run on scale, maybe for a few buckets, fine. If you have hundreds of thousands of buckets, well, you're going to have a huge fleet of EC2 instances to scan it. And again, it's not just not cloud native, it's a cloud inch pattern, right? And discussing with these customers that had all these challenges, that came up with their own in-house solutions, we came up with Cloud One File Storage Security. As of today, it just works for Amazon S3, but future support for Azure Blob Storage and Google Cloud Storage are planned, okay? And it's a serverless approach to protecting your files inside of S3 buckets. Really simple. So we have advanced anti-malware running in a serverless fashion, protecting files as they are dropped in these buckets. Simple. If you ask me, probably almost like a really boring technology, but that's what is its highlight, right? It's simple, it works, and allows you to do any custom action that you want with the result of the scan. So you don't need to change your current workflow or your flow. You don't need to break anything that you currently have, and you can actually act on the scan result. So that's pretty much what the deployment would look like in your environment. There are some, like I said, cloud native pieces going on here. We have Lambdas, SNS, SQS. And by default, we are going to scan, whenever we scan, we're going to tag your object, tagged as, was it scanned, yes or no? When was it scanned? And what are the results of the scan? Malware, not malware. If it is a malware, what's the malware, right? But we allow you to create your own custom actions based on the result as well. So I might want to, I don't know, quarantine what is malware. I might want to promote to a different bucket those that are clean. I might want to alert my customer that his device or her device is potentially infected with malware, right? So really simple technology. Like I said, almost boring, but that's great. And you're going to get, in minutes, you are scanning your files in your S3 buckets and you have results and you can act on them, right? That's pretty much it. Unless anybody has questions, then I would love to discuss those with you.
Great, thanks, Rafi. And I know we're running through our agenda. We're a little ahead of schedule. So if there are no questions, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Philip Bogle, who will talk a little bit about the last piece of our Cloud One security platform. And it's some pretty neat stuff on the network side. Over to you, Phil. Hey, Phil, you may be on mute. Not sure if you were talking. We started to see your screen.
As someone who gives this talk a lot, you think I would be able to catch on to that? and take myself off mute. So thank you very much. As said, my name is Philip Ogle. I'm a technical advisor with Trend Micro. I'm here to talk today a little bit about something called Cloud One Network Security. So Cloud One Security came from the acquisition I was purchased through, Tipping Point. So several years ago, Trend Micro wanted to enter into the network space, and they purchased Tipping Point IPS, which I will say is probably one of the premier intrusion prevention systems on the network in the space today. However, I think they honestly bought us for two reasons. And that is Trend continues to make significant capital investments into threat research and security research. And the security research arm of Tipping Point is a division called the Zero Day Initiative. The Zero Day Initiative is the largest vendor agnostic bug bounty program in the world. Now, I'm going to pick on Brian a little bit because he is our MC. So a use case might be Brian finds a 0 day in any kind of product. Let's just say Microsoft Edge is an example. Brian could come to us and say, hey, I have a vulnerability I'd like to sell to Trend Micro. And we're going to ask some questions and get more information about, hey, tell me more about this vulnerability, Brian. We're going to sign a non-disclosure agreement with him. And we're going to ask a very important question. Brian, do you have a POC? Do you have script that can leverage that vulnerability to give me access? And if he does, we're going to offer him a significant level of cash. At the same time, we're going to notify the affected vendor, in this case, it's Microsoft, and create a filter or a digital vaccine, as we call it, protect our customers. Now, we have two different kind of filters on the solution. So one is one from the ZDI, the pre-disclose filter, and we're not going to give a lot of information because we want to protect the vendor and not release too much data about their vulnerability. Well, eventually the vendor is going to respond. And at some point it's going to remain patched or it's going to get patched or remain unfixed. Now, I'm going to tell a little bit of story afterwards. It's kind of a funny one to me and pick on another vendor because the ZDI program is a CVE issuing authority. So we have another vendor, I'll just name called Foxit Reader. Foxit had a reader application and a bug bounty was found and submitted to us. We notified the vendor. We give vendors 120 days to respond. Day 59 came, halfway there, reach out to them, no response. You know, day 80 came, so on and so forth. Now we're down to day 119. No response, but all of a sudden we get an email. It's from Foxit. Hey, we're not going to fix that. Great. So we release the information, do a public disclosure, it gets on MITRE, gets on NIST, and here's the CVE ID, here's the CVSS base 2, base 3 scores, here are the attack vectors and ancillary information. It got disclosed. Foxit went, oh, wait a second. When we said we were not going to provide a patch, what we meant to say is, here's the patch. So the purpose of ZDI is to help vendors secure their applications, one, and two, kind of force vendors to act more responsibly. And that is the power of ZDI. And as you can see, if you're just looking at the 0 days that we find, there's an 81-day gap between when the 0 day is identified, as far as we were protecting it, to the actual public disclosure. So they wanted Tipping Point to come into the house and said, hey, we're going to throw a lot of R&D money at you. We want to, basically be in the network space, but we want to do something better than that. We are a cloud company. And so we want to work with you to not just mature your product, but to help you move your solution to the cloud to help our customers that are moving to the cloud. But before you do that, we want you to first reach out and talk to other customers and find out what the pain points are, and then develop a philosophy and come back to us. So the leadership at Tipping Point did exactly that. They talked to customers that had been down this road before, and they saw the problems were, hey, you know what? It's very unnatural. It's very expensive to forklift solutions, network solutions into the cloud as far as time management goes. And it introduces quite a bit of disruption. And those are things that we wanted to avoid. So that led to our philosophy being something very simple. We're going to be very cloud efficient, right? And we're going to solve the customer pain points of having simplified deployments. And we still are going to use our threat research and security research, but we're going to add it in to protect assets that are in the cloud infrastructure, as well as use our cloud expertise to help customers achieve better security. So from that, we developed the Cloud One Network Security. Just like the tipping point IPS that sits in many on-premise environments today, it uses the exact same flow-based engines. Now, we have several engines on them, but we use something called the regular Perl-compatible regular expression engine. That is pretty much the gold standard. However, in tipping point space, we invented our own regular expression engine that basically runs almost as fast as a string match. So we ported that into this inspection engine as well. You can insert this appliance in your fabric and move it in and out of line with a Lambda script without disrupting any traffic. There are very few pieces that you have to actually deploy, and we're able to inspect ingress and egress. And you can put us in your VPCs in line wherever you need us. Now, with that, I'd like to talk about a few use cases. So this is a use case of an inbound inspection. So ingress, bad actors try to access my assets. They come to my internet gateway and then go to my NAT gateway and transit gateway, and then it's going to be sent to the inspection VPC. The inspection VPC is going to detect this, alert it, and drop that traffic. But at the same time, allow your good users to come in and access the resources they need. Similarly, we can block via egress. So one of my hosts may have been compromised and it's trying to do a CNC callback to a server on the internet. Well, that traffic has to route to the transit gateway, go to the inspection VPC, where we're going to again detect, drop, and alert that. And we're going to prevent that CNC connection from happening. But at the same time, normal users, whether they're internal or customers, can access my resources as needed. There's also a case for lateral movement. So if you're architected specifically to where it goes to the inspection VPC, I may have an adversary internally that owns one of my assets and is going to do a SQL injection. And again, it's going to go through and go to the IPS, and it's going to alert, and it's going to drop that traffic, but allow all the good traffic to still pass through. With that said, I would be amiss if I didn't talk about, at least mention, the latest and greatest deployment model from AWS. And that is called the Gateway Load Balancer. In fact, let me just do this. Everyone, I'm going to put an article that goes to the AWS blog that will actually walk you through and tell you everything about the Gateway Load Balancer. What I like about the Gateway Load Balancer is it takes me back to my old days of running security in a healthcare space. I had over 100 hospitals coming back in a hub and spoke topology. So whether you're going to another hospital, lateral movement, or if you're going to the internets, or coming back to the corporate office, you went through my controls. It was truly a hub and spoke. And the power of the Gateway Load Balancer is it takes us back to where we can have a dedicated inspection VPC, and it's going to stack up our solutions for security and traffic, whether they're coming, laterally, so from one VPC to another VPC, you can inspect it with the Gateway Load Balancer solution. Similarly, ingress traffic and egress traffic can be routed that way too. So you have a dedicated inspection load balancer, and it does several things. So appliances that you put in your VPCs are not scalable. The high availability is usually limited to being able to fail open via Lambda scripts. And sometimes the virtual appliances are deployed in mixed domains and can cause confusion. And this is just an example of my internet gateway and my workload VPCs. And we're using layer 3, layer 4 as we're putting data over to the security VPC to be inspected with the assets on the gateway load balancer. Now, the question I get asked quite a bit, even though I'm not a salesperson, is cost. The other thing that we've poured over, thanks to Trend kind of guiding us along the way, is we don't have to buy a license anymore. Much like you do in everything else in Amazon, you just pay for what you use. And so per gigabit inspected throughput, as far as what you will be paying to Trend, it is basically 0.013 cents for every gig of inspected traffic. And that will include the mainline DVs, as I call it. So things that come out on Tuesdays. So think Adobe patches, Microsoft patches, things of that nature. That includes our threat DV. So our malware DVs, things that are really relevant in the PCI space, as an example, as well as reputation DV. So looking for bad URLs, bad domains, bad IP addresses. We are going to support SSL inspection, and we're going to be managed in the Cloud One management platform. Now, I went literally 100 miles an hour. If there are any questions, love to entertain those now. And if not, I will pass it off to Matt.
Great, thanks, Phil. As we wrap up this one, Brittany, what do you have for us in terms of timeline or next steps for the hands-on or the next module we've got here?
Yeah, so we have the hands-on scheduled for 11:30 Eastern. So if we want to take a quick 5-minute break and come back, and we'll get started from Nick Farrell and Matt Chapman. If you didn't initially opt in to participate in the workshop, I'll go ahead and send the link of where you need to go ahead and log in and sign up for a trial of workload security. I'll add that in the Zoom. But for now, if we just want to meet back at 11:25, start it then. Thanks,
Great.
Brian.
Well, thanks for your time, everybody. Some great content here. Look forward to follow-up discussions. And the hands-on workshop will be fun. So we've got a number of facilitators to help out and look over your shoulder and get you playing with some of this tech. Great. It's nice to see that we still got a pretty full house here. So, Brittany, are we about ready to get started on the hands-on portion?
Think so. Thanks, Brian.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Matt Chapman and Nick Farrell. Take it away, guys, and let's see how far we can get over the next 30 minutes here.
Sure thing. So got about 30 on, a mix of some trenders and a lot of customers. So curious how many people actually have the demo going or already have workload security, or what we used to call deep security as a service, that actually want to follow along and do the installation. And if not, you guys can just kind of watch over the shoulders and ask any questions you have of me or Nick. So I don't know if there's a way to, that would have been a good poll question, I guess, Brittany.
Also, this is Nick. I will be watching the chat channel. So if you have any questions about anything Matt's doing, or you're following along and running into any troubles, feel free to ask a question. We'll take a look.
Yeah, and a quick question for you guys. You did send credentials, right?
Hey, Mauro, yes, we did. But if you didn't receive them, I'm going to add them in the chat again.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Also, you know, what you'll do is sign up for a 30-day free demo account at that cloud1.trendmicro.com address, and you'll create credentials there as part of that process.
And I believe, because I can see the recording button going on in the corner, so this will be available later as well. So if you're not able to follow along with your own environment through the demo, go ahead and use the demo link later and watch the recording of this at this portion of the webinar, and you can kind of walk through with your own environment. We knew it was a little bit hard for everyone to kind of get on the link, get the 30-day trial going, and also, you know, pick a server that you want or instance that you want to put this on. But we wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of follow along if you wanted to. And like Nick said, any question you have as we go, just let me know. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to share the console. I'm going to throw around the console here so you guys can kind of get a good overview of some things. And as we're going, like I said, just ask questions as we go. So if you're already a workload security customer and have some burning question you've been wanting to ask for a while, then have at it. I have basically an Ubuntu 20 version Linux box running, and the good old Windows 2012 R2 server running as well. I'm going to be putting the script on both of them. First, we're going to run through the console a little bit, and then we'll get into that. So that's the environments I'm using. So if you're using Linux, you'll see how that works. If you're using Windows, you'll see how that works. So for those of you that have it, or those of you that are just following over my shoulder, this is the dashboard for workload security. And this is the same place I was at yesterday when I was protecting that, that workstation or server, sorry, from a zero logon. What I want to show you real quick is just from a standpoint of policies, right? So we're going to want to create a policy here in a minute. And we'll get to that as we get closer to actually deploying. But the essential one I've made for this purpose is I just called it webinar based. There's nothing really in it. It just has the malware engine turned on and the IPS function turned on. So we'll show those modules when we get to that. One of the things that Nick and I discussed yesterday after showing this off was just what does all this mean, right? So we see some things over here. And if you've got an AWS account, an Azure account, and you're wondering, well, how do I get these things in here to get visibility? You have all of these connectors that you can use, and they're even color coded so you know what you're looking at. And you can have multiple ones of each as well. As you can see here, we have add AWS account, and I have 2 of those running.
And we've talked, you know, over the past day about organizations increasingly, you know, having more accounts built around smaller things like even microservices, right? So for a security team, one of the challenges you're facing these days in the cloud is how do I get my hands around all these accounts, you know, that are all over the place spinning up who knows what, right? So with these connectors, you're able to actually plug Cloud One workload security directly into your various public cloud accounts. And then as infrastructure is created in those accounts, boom, it appears in your console. No need to discover anything or orphan anything, just a real-time synchronization of all your IaaS workloads across all of your public cloud accounts.
Yep. And the neat thing is when you look at like this account ID here for Amazon, you'll see I have the varying subnets out of that VPC in here as well. So they're all laid out. And also a good point from Nick there. As something ages out, or maybe you didn't realize that one of your developers has spun up an EC2 instance or Azure VM, and you're not watching the whole gamut of it until you get your bill. At least if you have the connector running, you do have some visibility here. As you can see, I have a Windows server laying out there that's unmanaged and the VM is stopped. It hasn't been on here since 2017, but I decided not to age it out just so I could see it, but it's still there. I mean, if I log into my Azure account, I can still turn it on, but it's there, right? So this gives you that visibility into all of those environments across them. And the ones that don't have, the distinction here, the ones that don't have something correlated to, let's say, an Amazon or Azure or Google Cloud, the ones that are coming out of maybe, right next to my desk over here that's making all this noise, they come from over here. They'll be up here. They'll be listed as computers. So just some organization tips there.
And we've got documented on our Cloud One Help Center some integrations with things like Control Tower. We can do landing zones and automatically push the agent out to existing infrastructure. So for those larger environments where you've got these standardized methods of deploying accounts, we can build the process of adding those directly into here.
And just like yesterday, this was not the one we attacked yesterday, but just to give you an example, any of these, opening them up individually will tell you what policy they're attached to, what tenant relay they're in, if they're in a different relay group, what their status is, what services they have on. So this is basically taking the policy, and in some cases, the policy and whatever overrides you've done against it. So let's go ahead and look at how do we get this machine in here, right? And Nick just mentioned one of the newer ways. There's also deployment. There's also newer ways with, if I'm in the middle of Adam Boyle's maintenance, I'm going to die. So there's other ways as well, MSIs, but one of the tried and true methods I'm going to show you today is the scripts, right? So with deployment scripts, which have gotten so much nicer as we've matured the product, this is some neat stuff we can do here. So here's a Linux deployment script. And as you're building it out, you can say, do I want to activate the agent automatically after installation, right? Do I want to go ahead and attach it to a policy? So does my script automatically get a particular policy just because I want to start there, right? I typically do that if it's a large group. Say we have a bunch of web servers that are exactly going to be the same, right? So we make this cool policy. It has all the exemptions we want to have in there. We establish the security policy that we're going to sit for that, so the posture starts a certain way. Especially in something like a group that's actually a scaling group, right? Say in AWS, as that thing boots up and it starts installing everything, why not go ahead and give it the policy it's supposed to have, right?
Also,
that through tag.
And another thing, another way of doing that here, you can also set the policy to none. And Matt's going to show us probably in a little bit some really cool logic that we've got called event-based tasks that you can just tell an agent during its installation, I want you to activate against the backend, but I don't want you to specify a policy. And as that activation comes in, the Cloud One Workload Security will see it and say, okay, I've got this event-based task rule that said an agent is activating, it's got the following tag, it's got the following string in its name or whatever criteria, therefore I'm going to assign it this other policy. And so if it makes sense in your deployment type to specify a policy here, you absolutely can. And if it makes more sense for your environment to pass one install script out to all the different application teams and control the policy assignment logic on the back end, we can show you how to do that shortly here as well.
So I may have you do that one, Nick. Both of mine are local. I'm not doing one out of the cloud, so I don't have one out of a tag, but I can show where that starts from an event-based piece. Yeah. So the policy is pretty simple, and the Linux one is neat now because it actually does a detection base, so it determines whether it's going to be Red Hat based or Debian based, so it makes that determination through this detect script. And you can kind of see the whole thing here if you want to take a look at how it operates. It's just a bash script for Linux. And if you do assign the policy here, which I typically don't, like to Nick's point, but it'll say like there'll be another piece of code here. It'll just like policy ID equals and the number of the actual policy, which is important because if you delete that policy, but you're still deploying things as policies, they'll come up with a blank policy or no policy.
And it also works pretty well to have these be bash script because it's pretty universally compatible across all the distributions. So most customers that I work with don't have any problems with these scripts. They tend to work really well.
Yep. So we also have Windows agent deployment, which you might guess now is going to be a PowerShell, right? Same thing, but in PowerShell. And it does require PowerShell 4. So that's all over the place there. So that will come up. There's a couple of other things that you might have to do as far as if you have to run the PowerShell as administrator, and you may have to, if you're following along when we get to that part, you may have to have for that particular process for the installation a set execution policy scope for execution policy bypass, because I think it was, I'm not sure if it's 2008 or not, but I know 2012 forward, that in PowerShell was something that was a protection piece. So you just couldn't run arbitrary scripts that affect the system. So that's where you grab them. You can see both of these had save to a file or copy to a clipboard. So if you're in your tenant right now, and I'm not sure how many people are actually following along that way, but if you're in your tenant and you're logged in, you can actually log in even from your works, from the server you're trying to protect, and save to a file, and then we can move on our way that way. Or you can copy to clipboard or save it to a file and move it to the server you need to. So looking at the policy I will probably be using here in a moment. What I've done is, we can do a quick overview of each of these if you wish, but anti-malware, obviously this is the malware engine, right? The web reputation engine is web reputation based on, if you're using any of the other trend products, think of like the endpoint with web reputation, where we're looking to see the reputation, if you will, of the website or IP address that the system is trying to access, either through the browser or even through payload scripting. So if you've actually downloaded something else from somewhere and that piece of software is trying to go out and grab payload from a known website or a known IP address that we know is suspicious or malicious, we can block it that way. So that's turned on. Typically, I see customers turning this one on. I don't know about you, Nick, but I see customers turning this one on when they're development boxes that they're allowing the developers to play on, or their jump boxes that allow access to other servers.
Yeah, you know, servers can do a lot over HTTP, so it's important to configure this correctly. It is good to be watching outgoing connections to things like command and control sites and all of that. One thing that I generally have customers do for web reputation, if they're going to use it, is if you go to that exceptions tab right next to general there, Matt, you can actually put your internal domains in here. So company.local, company.com, anything your organization does business on, and put it in the allowed list. That way, the web reputation engine knows that it never has to check connections to those domains because they're yours, and we know the reputation is good. That can help make sure that this doesn't cause you any HTTP, overhead problems.
Yep. And the one that we'll be doing today, along with malware, is the IPS piece. So this is what we showed off yesterday with preventing the zero logon attack. So I found it prevalent to maybe show that as relevant to show that on this one as well. So we're going to turn this one on. And in this policy, I have it set to prevent. I have it turned on, but I have no rules. So you can do, if you know of some established rules, say for a segment of servers you're protecting that are always going to be in a particular state, you can you can actually scan those boxes and establish a rule pattern for them that goes as a baseline across all of them. I typically will leave it, and this kind of goes to that best practice kind of part of the conversation. I usually leave this one blank. And the reason why I leave it blank is I let the system do what it's supposed to do, which is the recommendation scan, and pull together what it actually needs to protect based on the posture of the system at the time.
Yep. Automating the assignment of those rules is one of Cloud One Workload Security's most appreciated pieces of magic, and it saves security admins a lot of time. For those of you who are using this to protect the web server, it is a good idea to hit that assign, unassign button and go in there and look, just type generic, and you'll find some generic web server rules for things like generic cross-site scripting and generic SQL and injection and those kind of things. They can be added on top of the rule set. If you scroll down just a little bit, Matt, it can be added on top of the right there. Those rules will not be automatically assigned via recommendation scan because they're generic. But if you're using this, I would recommend throwing those in there just to catch some stuff that may not even be related to a CVE. It's just an attempt to exploit a poorly designed website or something like that.
Yeah, there's a couple of those for the website. There's a couple also for SQL, I believe, as well. Well, not just SQL injection, but SQL overall. So there's also some in here called smart ones, right? So they're not based against anything in particular from like next point for the generic one for anything that's CVE based. There's smart rules in here that are based against ransomware and things like that. So it kind of adds another level of protection in the malware piece. So yeah, you can add some in here if you know you have a front-facing web server, or something that's going to be right there to be in front of everybody, maybe in a DMZ type of scenario, or you're open on that particular VPC for AWS. So yeah, also something good to keep in mind. Thank you, Nick. Does anybody have any questions so far? I don't see the chat hitting up anything special yet. Nick, you see anything in there?
No, I've been kind of keeping an eye on it. We're doing good so far. Also worth noting, as you see there, this particular engine, by virtue of where it hooks in to the host OS, is able to scan container traffic as well, right? So if someone has a vulnerable version of some web app running in a container, the Cloud One Workload Security Agent is able to protect that as well.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm at with that piece. I think you mentioned.
Yeah, event-based tasks. So this is a really commonly used piece of kit with workload security that's a lot of my customers leverage. So let's say I have an agent-initiated activation, something built out of a build pipeline or whatever that's scripted to automatically, like Matt showed you earlier, reach out and activate itself during the installation. So I can say, let's assign the policy that I want it to have, whatever policy that is, and let's do it because when it activated, it had cloud instance metadata that matches a certain tag set that I've got out there, and it's got a certain string in its computer name. Maybe you can put multiple condition checks in here to scope these in under as tight a circumstances as you want. But at the end of the day, the end game here is that as machines activated based on criteria that you specify, they get a policy assigned, and that's another time saver operationally, because now if I change a policy or I add a new policy number or whatever, I don't have to hand out a bunch of new copies of my activation and install scripts. I can keep the same scripts out there and just make the logic change on the back end.
Yeah, it's also good if you're doing like true blue green, right? So I have a dev machine and I built it up, and I'm running and testing the IPS rules, for example, in detect mode, like we talked about yesterday, right? And we've come to the point where we go, okay, the application that we just built is working. It's not flagging anything on the IPS. We're safe to go to production for this. At that point, most people aren't doing as far of a pipeline. They're not building a whole new machine. They're building a new dev one to start from a fresh piece, and they're changing the dev one by tag to prod, right? So we could say the tag value changes to prod here automatically on the back end. Like Nick said, the magic happens, and that machine switches from, that instance switches from a dev policy that you've set up here, maybe like -dev, you've named it, to a -prod policy. And maybe the only change in that entire policy is the IPS thing goes from detect to prevent, right? So that's pretty.
Yep. And if we could like switch to a completely different kind of silo, while we're here under the administration tab, go over to system settings, and then let's talk about SNS forwarding if we can.
Where are we? I don't have mine set, but go ahead if you want.
No, it's okay. So basically the idea here is, any of the events from the security modules that we've talked about, maybe it's an intrusion prevention event or something in integrity monitoring that makes you suspect the integrity of the system. Any events that happen can actually turn into SNS events. And then of course you can fire off Lambda functions based on those to do whatever you want. So another really nice aspect of this is not only are we taking the notification of the events forward, for security operations to look at, you can also programmatically take the events forward to kick off playbooks, or do whatever you'd like in the environments.
Or even move systems to a quarantine VPC. So we also, while we're on this page, right, we also have the SIM. So if all you have to do is add your SIM here, and the system events will actually be forwarded to that SIM. There's some help files obviously in here. When you're using a SaaS environment, okay, the question is going to be like, well, how do I know where it's coming from? We have all that laid out as far as the IP addresses of where and what ports obviously you need to have it work. We have a lot of customers doing this, sending it to Splunk and Logarithm and just about anything else you can think of. So it works very well with that as well. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick. We don't see any magic computers here. Let's go ahead and switch over to a system. Is anyone following along on the Linux side that wants to see this fun magic? I basically have an Ubuntu 20 box running right here locally with me. I've put the deployment script that you saw earlier from the support dropdown on the system. It's just sitting there. I'm running as root, obviously, as you can tell by the pound sign. So I'm ready to go. And essentially just run the script. So the script's going to do what it normally does. It's going to run out, grab the file, and install the agent package. I did not do any tying this to a policy. And since I'm not running anything in the cloud with a tag, obviously I'm not going to do the event-based one, but I'll show you how we can get it running over here.
This install works the exact same way, like say in user data.
And then we get command completed. So that's how quick. So think of like a spin up script that you have in AWS, or you have, you know, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, whatever you could put a script in, and this is how you manage your systems. Or even to some degree on the Canonical side for Ubuntu, there's some backend stuff that you can do for that as well. Same thing in RHN for Red Hat. But if you can put a script piece anywhere, a loader script, then you could put this bash script. And as long as it can run with the credentials it needs through some kind of management software, then this is going to be able to do exactly what it did. It was designed originally with the intent that as a machine spun up, right, from, you know, under load, and now I'm going to throw off something from a scaling group, that it could install as it's being booted up and be protected by the time it's answering data. So very, very quick. So here's that box. It took the host name over. It's managed and online. I can see it. I can see the agents installed and running. I don't have a policy, so I can just go over here, say actions. This is just one way to do it. I can say assign a policy, drop down, and webinar base. In a few moments, it'll actually send that policy out, and you'll see that it's there.
The policy is the bit that actually turns on various security modules that you saw when we opened it up, you know, the IPS, the anti-malware. In order to keep the agent footprint light, the install will typically just install the base bits the agent needs to run. And then as a policy assigns it additional functionality, it will pull down those modules and put them in place. So
you can see that too right here, Nick, when we're doing since we only did 2 things in this policy, you'll see where it's installation pending, and also, you know, this one's in progress, right? So as this progresses for those pieces and parts, like Nick said, we wanted it to be very, very small just going out, but now that it's on there, now we can see we already have both these running. So that Linux box only required 10 rules. So if we wanted to see what those rules were, as it's doing an update in progress, here's some of the rules we have, right? So it did the recommendation scan right off the bat. It'll also go through once a week by default, unless you change it, to do the same thing again, to check the posture of the system and apply what it needs to apply. It's kind of nice too. I mean, this is like my favorite module. That's why I always harp on it. But you're putting yourself in a protected state more often than you would have been. And when you go to patch the next time, the system will actually run a scan and go, hey, okay, I see he's patched this. I don't need to put this in the loop anymore. I don't need to pick up memory to actually look at this piece and protect against this piece. So it's really great at staying ahead of the curve on that. A lot of rules here. So also you'll see here where it told you that when you look in the module, you can see when the last time it was, and I have mine by default to inherit to yes, which means it'll self-govern itself. So after it runs its recommendation scan, which like I said, by default does every week. If you want to change that to more often, you can, or less often. And then once it runs a recommendation scan, do I want to go ahead and apply these or not, right? So I put mine to apply yes. I'm pretty confident with the IPS at this point. So I let that thing just do its thing.
And, you know, just to take a step back and look at it from an organizational security posture, take a look at the different security modules that we see on the left-hand side, you know, of this particular system's properties. You have everything there from anti-malware to checking the reputation of web connections to EDR to application control, the kind of integrity monitoring that checks compliance boxes, you know, that you have to check, log inspection, you know, host-based IPS. You know, we talk about Cloud One as a platform of security tools for cloud builders, and we've talked a little bit about that, including things like S3 bucket scanning and, you know, cloud native network IPS and cloud posture management and all these other things, right? So organizations are starting to get their hands around the idea that cloud security means so many different things and so much more past infrastructure. You got to do infrastructure, right? I mean, this is your base. So having a cloud native infrastructure tooling that allows you to consolidate all of security controls, nobody has time for 4 different endpoint agents on all of their infrastructure as it's dynamically appearing. So these are the kind of problems that we've aimed to solve with this particular solution, even with an eye that cloud security means so much more.
Yeah, if you turn on pretty much all the modules to protect the system, you're checking off, if I'm remembering this correctly from a PCI perspective, you're checking off pretty much everything except for the physical lock to the data center being the check mark, and doing your own penetration testing, because we don't do that for you. So you're able to cover a lot of the boxes if you can turn these things on, because you're going to get some really good information about log inspection and integrity monitoring. It's not just monitoring the integrity of those files that have been changed, or the log inspection to tell you maybe there's things that have been actually hit in the box that you're not aware of. And to me, I mean, yeah, it's great. It checks those boxes for compliance and so forth, but it also, from a hacker's perspective, if you do have someone on your box that's camping and moving around, those particular two modules, the integrity monitoring and log inspection, will typically pick up the things that are happening. There's even one, I believe, in the log inspection, which will pick up if your PAMD or SSD log file is showing, or auth log is showing too many login attempts unsuccessfully over a certain amount of time. So it flags and basically says this is a brute force attempt. So things like that are really good to have as well.
Yeah, there are. If you get bored sometime, on the policies tab towards the top, you get to see the big bucket rule sets for things like IPS and log inspection and integrity monitoring. For log inspection, if you open up that big bucket of rules and look for, there's several generic Windows rule sets in there that if you open those up and cruise through them, the amount of things that this agent is actively watching for. So like, let's see, Microsoft Windows security events in there somewhere, I think, if we scroll down a little farther. The amount of things that, and there's like 3 of these rules, right? So go to configuration and just scroll down and look through. If a nefarious actor were to gain a foothold on a system, it's going to be very hard for them to move around and do anything without tripping some of these alarms. To Matt's point, very powerful security control.
Yeah, and there's a reason why it checks that compliance box, right? Because it actually does some things that are really needed.
And also for these modules, integrity monitoring, log inspection, and a couple others, you can write your own custom rules. So maybe you've got some, homegrown application that you want to, monitor in a certain directory, or look for something in a log. I'm able to create my own rules to my own things. And, any good sysadmin knows that you can send anything you want to a log. And if you can create a custom rule to look for anything you want in a log, it creates a really powerful, tool that you can use to get visibility into any part of your operations on infrastructure.
Yeah, these are the other ones you're looking at. My mouse is not liking me right now, sorry. Yeah, so different levels here of all of this stuff. So good at seeing what's maybe being attacked against you that's not IPS based, and also good at actually watching if you have a camper, right? So, and also if you really want to stay up late or you can't get to sleep, there's a lot of stuff in here to read. And if you're looking for a particular CVE, you can do that as well. And I'm going to test my memory here. Oops, Eve, not Steve.
And I want to tag on to something that Matt said earlier. This particular engine for intrusion prevention is not just about blocking the exploit of known software vulnerabilities and things like that. We're trying to look for any kind of evil that we can traversing a network interface. So lateral ransomware propagation, key exchanges, command and control, all kinds of things like that.
So awesome. I like it too. That's one. If I can just type today, guys, really makes you trust my scripting ability today. So here you go. So just typing in zero login, if I could remember that 1472, as many times as I've done that demo, you'd think I'd remember that. But here's 3 rules that we use just to protect the one we talked about yesterday and show that attack. So if you want to look at anything in particular, again, one of these shows up as a smart rule, so it's a little bit different because it's just identifying the brute force part of the attempt. But the actual elevation of privilege vulnerability, let me look at this one here. Just as we showed a little bit yesterday, here's the information, here's the vulnerability, and the actual links to where you can go read the stuff, the configuration options if you have any, and then which machines it's assigned to. So I have 2 servers actually that are vulnerable to that based on the recommendation scans.
Yeah, and when you look at the breadth of the remote exploit rules that exist here and combine that with, the automatic rule assignment by virtue of a recommendation scan, that means that operationally, the next 0 day that comes out doesn't have to be a fire drill. Run a recommendation scan on your systems, and any systems that are vulnerable should get the necessary rule.
Another big one from a little bit about year before, but still out there a lot. If you look at any of the sites keep track of that stuff, this is still a big vulnerability up there. So there's that. So we have not to take up too much labor on that one, but we have the webinar-based policy applied. It's running on Ubuntu 20. So for the Windows guys out there, let's go ahead and show you the Windows side of things. So I've got the PowerShell script running. I mean, I've got to get it installed on here and ready to go. I'm running an administrative PowerShell window. And just remembering that things are backwards for those of us that actually run Linux more than Windows. You'll actually see how quick this goes. I mean, it's already there. And this is not like Matt's super 2012 server. It's like the bare minimum I can do to stand up a VM of it. So it's there, right? But it's now saying activation required. It's going through that process. You'll start to see some of the other pieces here, just like any one of our other products. You can kind of pull up and say, okay, so what's running and what's going on. Now, if we look at this window here and wait for the refresh, we should see it show up. Is anybody else going along with us and having any problems? Let's see. Here we are. So again, no policy, but it is managed. If you look back over here, we will see the changes as the policy goes across. Agents running. So should start seeing those go across, but that's how quick that script works, just to put that on there. Get you running and protected. So any
Which
questions?
is kind of required in this day and age where instances spin up so quickly behind auto-scaling groups and things like that.
Same thing again. So I also like that even though it's obviously a different scripting method to make it work, right? Because it's different operating systems. The beauty here is it's the same thing from a visibility standpoint in the console. So you're looking at, okay, what's the process of this? What's it doing? And you can see, although we have one base policy that I've worked off of here because I only had one thing to show, both of these machines will end up being very different when they're done. They're going to have the same malware stuff as far as protection goes. But if you can look at this, like the installation pending on an IPS, it's already scanning the system for its posture. We're up to 1,003 rules, whereas on the Linux one that was passed and up to date, I think had 10 if I remember correctly. But when this is done, this will be running 1,003 rules because I haven't patched this Windows box. This is as if I just installed a fresh Windows box from 2012. So you can see where it does establish itself a little differently depending on the current posture of the system. So the policy you start with is the base you're starting with, if that makes sense. Another thing that I've always liked about the way we do it as opposed to some of our competitors is when we do turn on these two modules, right? Just like our IPS, we didn't take like a network IPS of like 10,000 rules and just shove it into the memory space of a client and agent to work on the workstation or server. We take the rules and then we apply the recommendation scan, get the posture, and then give it what it needs. So it's only giving it what it needs. Same thing with these two. So if I'm running these modules, when the recommendation scan runs and the integrity baselines are done for these two modules, they're going to give me information that's only needed for that particular server. So I'm not going to have like, unless you're running Apache for Windows before I make that clarification, I'm not going to have Apache logs being looked at or looked for on a Windows box. It's going to see what's there. So it's going to say, oh, he's running IIS. I'm going to look at the IIS logs. Or he's got an etc host file because he's on a Linux box as opposed to an LM host file on a Windows box for the integrity monitoring. So it's also the agent's smart enough to know what it needs to have based on what is running on that box to make those determinations. So it keeps it nice and clean. And now both of those boxes in just that amount of time are both protected. So the deployment is really easy and quick. And the manageability, as you can see, you get that visibility right away. So any questions?
That means you explained it so thoroughly that no one has any questions.
I don't think that's the case, but that's basically what I wanted to show. I wanted to show you guys how simple it was. You know, the basics of the console, get you guys started. So if you're doing the demo, and if you're following along, you're going to follow along later with the link, go right ahead. Feel free to reach out to any of us for help in the future. And yeah, I just wanted to show how dead simple it is to take the scripts and do it. It's one of the many ways to do it, but it shows you a quick and easy way with the scripts, and knowing that you can incorporate that scripting into any other kind of deployment method, it makes it easy to understand how fast this thing can actually get up and running for you.
Let me, one other thing I guess we could point out, up in the very top right there, Matt, if you click on help, API and user guides,
Yep.
we make it very easy to pop over here and click on workload security in the middle there towards the top. Now, right here on this very first screen, you can see on the bottom left, you can get a list of all the supported Linux kernels, of which there are several. In the middle on the top there, you've got an API reference where we've got all the raw REST calls, called out and well documented. All kinds of help that you can get from here. As you can see, the control tower stuff is here. We support AWS private link if you want to connect to Cloud One workload security without traversing the internet directly, through the plumbing of AWS. Lots of good resources here in terms of how to do things that we try to be pretty available.
And also how to sign up for the free trial. the link again. So, yep, good point. It's actually probably our most mature one as far as API goes. It has the most pieces and parts you can handle from the API.